Welcome to this edition of Free Media, Free Minds with me, your host, Chelsea Noah Ogilvie. And we'll be hanging out for the next hour discussing the protection of journalists, but more specifically, the protection of female journalists. So joining us for this conversation is Crystal Audison, a journalist out of Cape Town, very local, as well as Brenda Harrison joining us out of Zimbabwe. And then we'll be joined by Zoe Mafoko, who is a journalism student joining us out of Magnadoor at Rhodes University. But for now, let's have a look at some of the complexities that come with being a journalist and not just doing the journalism. Check it out.
Dear young woman, I hope you find you. I hope you find love. I see all the armor you wear. I see all the jewels and gems of wisdom you share. It's okay to shine, ma. It's okay to shine. It's okay to have pride, ma. You don't have to live a lie. Don't let the violence fool you into silence, convincing you that you are not worthy of space and time. You might not know it yet, but you got a multi-dimensional set of eyes looking out for you. Trust that what is meant for you is relying on you to show up. Show up. You can lose your religion, but you will never lose your spirit. Each of your breaths have minds and lives of their own. I doubt we'll ever know the true impact of our presence. What a blessing. Young woman, I wish you enough. I wish you enough time for all of your skills and talents. I wish you more. I wish you more revelations than disrespects and regrets. And I beg you to believe in yourself more than your parents ever did. Carry out your curiosities in spite of the corruptions you experience. You let yourself free when you let yourself forgive. And so when you do, and I know you will, I hope you find you. I hope you find love again.
Now that we have some context on this conversation, we are going to now hear from Crystal Audison, a journalist joining us from Cape Town. Welcome to it. We are joining Crystal Audison at her stunning home on a very gloomy Wednesday afternoon, and we are discussing the protection of female journalists. So, Crystal, first of all, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. Can you just let us know a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Hi, thanks for having me on your show. So I'm a journalist based in Cape Town. I started, when South Africa got its freedom, and have covered stories from Cape Town to Cairo, across the continent, across the world. I was a broadcast journalist for the SABC, covering anything from gang violence to the rise of PAGID, to interviewing former President, the late Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, Jacob Zuma, Cyril Ramaphosa. And then I was fortunate to also be sent by the SABC to open the first West Africa office. So I was based in Senegal, in Dakar, covering West Africa and other parts of Africa as well for the SABC, doing radio and TV, and covering East Africa, Central Africa, North Africa, conflict zones, etc. And then for the past 6 years, I've been doing different things. I was a regional editor for a magazine called The Africa Report, covering political economy issues on the continent. I do radio.
We are chatting to Crystal Audison on the protection of female journalists. Let's take a break to pay the bills, and when we come back, we continue chatting to her. Welcome back from the ad break. We are still discussing the protection of female journalists. And joining us for this conversation is Crystal Audison, a local Cape Townian journalist. Fantastic. So you're just like an all-round journalist who's been in the game for a while, and I think it's safe to say that you've earned your stripes as a female journalist in the game. I don't know. Do you look like you disagree?
Well, I mean, I guess I have. I think when you've done journalism for, more than 20 years in my case. You just love what you do. And I mean, I think, unless you have a passion for storytelling, whether it's the story from the unemployed mother in Khayelitsha to the father that lost his son in Mitchell's Plain, or the father that lost his son in Kenya or Sierra Leone, it's the same concept. It's about telling stories. It's about being able to allow the person who's interviewing you, or that you come with your camera into someone's home, to make that person comfortable and tell their story, because it's important that we tell the story. And I think in South Africa's case more so, I mean, I entered and started my journalism career post 1994, so it was important for journalists, and especially journalists of color and black journalists, to tell the story that wasn't being told before. And I think in broadcasting and radio and TV, it's very important that we reflect the diversity of the country.
So if we do look at post-apartheid South African media, how are women represented in the media, whether it's as an actress or as a news anchor? How are women represented in post-apartheid South African media?
I think if we say post-apartheid media, I think we need to look at different phases in South Africa's history. So if we talk about the post-1994, there were very few women. And so in journalism, we were the first group of women that entered, or black women that entered the SABC. And it was a challenging terrain, because firstly, you were a woman of color. Secondly, you weren't blonde and blue-eyed. You didn't have a posh accent, and those were things that counted against you. I mean, for a lot of us working at the public broadcaster, we were told that our accents weren't good enough, our hair was too curly, and they wanted us to adhere to what the notion of a woman should be. And a woman was straight hair, accented, and there's nothing wrong to saying that you need to be able to pronounce and be able to let your viewers and your listeners understand what you say. But when it's directed at you because the way you speak, and because you're from the Cape Flats, or you're from a rural area, or you have a deep Zulu accent, you're not allowed to do English voiceovers, that's problematic. And so those were the battles that we had to take on in newsrooms, to be able to say we have a voice, we can tell the stories. But if we look more broadly, the representation of women, if we look at, I did a study, for instance, about the representation of women in soap operas. Again, it was that post-94 euphoria of ensuring that we get black women's voices, and in that, for instance, it's women with different hair, whether it's a chiskop, whether it's a curly, whether it's a weave. It's about choice that black women can have in terms of the diversity. So we saw that emergence of it. And then, of course, I think post-99, there was a lot of focus on getting new voices, getting women into the newsroom, which was very important, and a lot of focus on that. But then I think over the past few years, because of course it's more than 20 years into our democracy, I think we've had a lull, and I think we've actually backtracked on those promises. But I think it's not only in the newsroom or on TV that we see, it's in society. We've had a complete backlash against women if we look at the violence against women that's happening in our society. And I think that's very unfortunate that we've taken 10 steps forward and 20 steps back. But I think in part of the challenge is that South Africa has the most amazing laws. We've been hailed as having one of the most progressive constitutions in the world, but a constitution is a piece of paper. It should be a living document. It should be one that we own, from walking on the streets at night to seeing the diversity that we have. And unfortunately, our policy hasn't been practicalized, and we still yearn for the rights that we have on paper in our constitution.
So if considering that, how do we compare men to everything that you just said? How do men relate, and how are men represented in the media, considering everything that you just said now?
I think in the media, men's voices are still the dominant ones. If we look at who gives the most commentary on the economic dispensation, we never have a gendered analysis of what's actually happening. How does the budget impact on women? If we look at political analysts, the voices, the dominant voices are still men in our society. And I think that's the reality, the patriarchy in our society. And we see that we see the backlash. Every day we hear of a story of a young woman being butchered or killed by someone that she knows, and it's a man. And so we need to ask ourselves that again. We have a very patriarchal society. As much as there's been gains for women, there's also been a complete backlash. And I often wonder, having try to understand and study this, if we look at, for instance, the ANC, how the ANC was born in the early more than 107 years ago, we must look at it was very male, and it's only much later that, for instance, the voices of women were allowed in terms of the ANC Women's League, for instance, and it was always seen as that it's one struggle, it's not a specific gendered struggle, and that struggle was only allowed to flourish during the negotiating process, where we had the ANC Women's League calling one of the first big conferences to look at the roadmap. And again, we had lots of progressive women writing, and that's why we have this constitution and we have all these laws and we have a ministry. But practically, what has it meant? I think it hasn't meant much for women.
Okay, so SANEF has recently condemned the harassment of journalists, which is fantastic. But once again, paper versus reality is two different things. What types of harassment in this conversation, what types of harassment do journalists face? And if you could elaborate on that, to speak on the harassment that female journalists face.
I mean, I think it's taken forms, and over the years, harassment has taken, different forms. And so, for instance, when I started, one of the first major stories I did was gang violence on the Cape Flats, and then the rise of people against gangsterism and drugs, which is called PAGID. And so, for instance, the harassment that women and young women in particular, like myself, faced was that, being threatened, being intimidated, etc. So that's kind of your 90s. I don't necessarily think that has changed for young women covering gang violence on the Cape Flats. But then we have young women reporting on service delivery protest. I think there's other harassments, and we know of how camera crews have been robbed, the equipment's been taken, or women don't even get sent out on those kind of stories because of violence, and then it's young male reporters that are sent out. So, but I think, and then we can talk about harassment within the newsroom of who has power, who's the editor. In most cases in South Africa, we have male editors, and yes, as much as this progress, this progression, we do know those inherent biases still take shape. So we have very few female editors in South Africa. That's the reality of it. Then we talk about harassment within political parties, and we've seen within the new kind of kid on the block in terms of political party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF, we've seen particular cases of harassment of women, and in particular Karima Brown, where it was absolutely vicious attacks against her race, against her religion, against telling her she needs to pack up and go back to India. I mean, really vicious attacks on women, and in particular in this case Karima Brown. And I think in other case, if we look at harassment, take two. If we look at harassment of Quinita Hunter at the Sunday Times, body shaming again by these political movements. And I think there are many other stories that we don't even know about, because if you look at the smaller towns, Limpopo, Mpumalanga, Eastern Cape, Northern Cape, the center of news will always be Cape Town, Johannesburg, Durban, Pretoria. Those are always going to be the epicenters. We don't know of those small-time reporters that are facing harassment and not being able even to voice those kind of issues that have come up. And so, of course, I think the South African National Editors Forum is a body, essentially, let's not be mistaken, this is a body that's run by editors. And what's very unfortunate, and for me, one of the saddest indictments to South African media, is that as journalists, there is nobody representing the voice of journalists. I was fortunate when I joined, there was, there were all sorts of journalist bodies that journalists belong to, that they could raise their issues. Right now, SANEF is the voice, and we should never get it twisted. They are editors, not reporters. And I think that for me is a serious and sad indictment of the post-94 South African media arena.
I think that is very sad, considering that it comes part and parcel of being a journalist, especially a female journalist, that you know that going into the field, you're going to probably face something related to the fact that you're a woman. Okay, so we are going to chat a little bit more about this after the ad break. We are speaking to Crystal Alderson, a female journalist, joining us on this conversation about the protection of female journalists. We'll be back in a sec. That was Crystal Alderson chatting to us on the protection of female journalists this evening. So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll have a chat with Brenda Harris out of Zimbabwe. Welcome back to Free Media, Free Minds here on Cape Town TV. So we are discussing tonight the protection of female journalists, and right about now we will head into an interview with Brenda Harris, who is a Zimbabwean journalist herself. Let's head over to Zimbabwe to hear what she has to say.
My name is Lulu Brenda Harris. I'm one of the female journalists working in Zimbabwe. My work as a journalist in Zimbabwe has been both good and bad. Good in the sense that you have a chance to educate the public, you have a chance to entertain the public, and you have a chance to inform the public about what is happening in the country. And the public in turn looks up to you to hold the powerful into account. The good side of journalism is that there are opportunities for one to travel, the opportunities for one to learn, the opportunities to one to educate other people, which I enjoy doing. When we talk of the bad side of journalism, I mean our country's politics have become so toxic, to the point that even the media itself has become so polarized. The media is divided into two arms. We have the pro-state and we have the anti-state. And this becomes difficult for audiences to actually discern what the truth is. They think that the media now lacks credibility because either they will align themselves to the state or they will align themselves to those who are anti the state. We also have harsh legislation that is yet to be repealed, and this is taking a long time for government to do so. And generally, journalism is an unrewarding profession. You work hard for many hours and less pay. There is less remuneration, and you find that journalists sometimes become so frustrated that even though they have this powerful role of informing the public, they're not really recognized in that manner due to the remuneration that they sometimes see. And another bad side to journalism is the competition from the fifth estate. Since we journalists are known as the fourth estate, we're now having to compete for news with the fifth estate. And this is your ordinary people, the person out there with his phone in his pocket or hand, the person out there who is always on the scene first before you, the journalist, comes to that scene. So yeah, we find that sometimes now people are saying that news belongs to bloggers. As a female journalist, one has to work twice as harder as a male counterpart for you to be taken seriously. I mean, journalism itself is a very challenging profession, more so when you're a woman and you have all these pressures that come from society. A woman has to be back home at 6 o'clock, a woman has to cook for the family. But now when you're in journalism, which is a 24-hour job, you don't have time to do those things. And sometimes that's why men think that women are not meant to be in the newsrooms, and they prefer for women to be given softer bits, such as covering entertainment, covering fashion, or even cooking, and women are sidelined from covering hard bits such as your politics or science issues or climate change issues, because I think women cannot handle such topics, which I think is really, really unfair, because women also deserve the chance and opportunities to do so and show that they are also capable. I think with the right mentoring in the newsrooms, women can fairly be up for this challenge. They can also do very well, and then they can also match up to their male counterparts. It's a matter of just prioritizing and assigning the right topics and the right bits to women, and also giving them a chance. We also have a challenge where we have less female editors in our newsrooms, and if you listen to discussions where men are involved, they always say that women are not meant to be in the newsrooms because either they move away for other professions such as public relations, or women choose to get married and ultimately they don't have time to be in the newsroom anymore. I think this is also due to patriarchy. You have to see how patriarchy is considered in society. Patriarchy is a challenge to our society. So now in the newsrooms, which is often seen as a male-dominated clique, it's like a more for boys network, and which makes it harder for sisters to penetrate that sector. There's bound to be such thinking. We have heard discussions where men say that women cannot manage pressure, They're easily frustrated, they're easily stressed, and they cannot manage a team. Therefore, that's why they cannot be assigned to be editors or be in charge of a desk, which is really, really unfair. It's a matter of just assigning somebody and making sure that they receive the right support and backing. Another challenge to women is that they have less backing or support from their own female colleagues, their own male colleagues, or even the boss themselves, who choose to mentor a male for the job and sidelining the girl, thinking that, oh well, if it's 6 o'clock, she'll go home. So it's a matter of simply mentoring somebody to be the best they can be. Besides the challenges that are faced by women in the newsrooms, women journalists are also prone to human rights violations, that is abduction and intimidation. We have a case of a female creative who was recently abducted in August by armed gunmen. She was taken away from her home, was beaten up, she was made to drink sewer water. Her name is Samantha Korea, pretty known as Gonetti. She's in charge of some comedy show called Bus Stop TV. So Gonetti, through her works, has been challenging the state, criticizing the state and the police, and using humor to make people laugh about what the state does. But unfortunately, for her work, she was rewarded by being abducted. So this has been very scary for us female journalists who wonder what if we publish something that authorities don't like, they will pounce on you. And again, abductions in Zimbabwe have become a buzzword. We have members of the opposition who have been abducted, members of the civil society who have been abducted, and then government claims they do not know who is behind this. They had said that they are not a part of these abductions, but allege that the dead force is allegedly to be the one abducting these people. So, and sometimes they think that these abductions are stage managed, which becomes difficult for you to be safe. Now, journalism in Zimbabwe is a precarious profession. Journalists find it hard to work, they find it hard to maneuver, or find it hard to actually gather stories or access information. Public institutions often withhold information from journalists deliberately. They don't want journalists to access information, they frustrate you in the process, they delay the information, and finally, when they do release that information is doctored or half-baked. It only serves to suit them and not you or your story or whatever you think it will aim to achieve in the end. There have been more cases of media violations against journalists. There have been more journalists who have been harassed either by police or by state security officials. Journalism is now seen as a crime, where even at the slightest provocation, police think that journalists are out there to get them, they're out there to cover them negatively, and so they tend to want to control journalists. But this is not what we are about. We're out there to get the truth, we're out there to get a real picture, we're out there to paint a picture of what is happening in the country. Journalists have also raised concern on the Gazetted Zimbabwe Media Bill that seeks to criminalize the journalism profession. The bill says one can be imprisoned up to 6 months. The bill also encourages self-censorship and comes up with a whole host of negative proposals that muzzle free speech. On the laws and policies that are meant to protect journalists or journalism industry, they are there on paper, yes, they purport to protect and guide or aid the profession, but in reality, they're doing the opposite. On what can be done to make sure that women are also seen as a force to be reckoned with in journalism, I think there needs to be mentoring. There should be strict mentoring of women where seniors or other older professionals guide women on how they can maneuver within news gathering, on how they can access information, and just simply mentoring them to grow from just being a journalist to be a desk editor, and one day you want to see more female editors. Our newsrooms need gender equality policies where that document will enable there's equality, there's equity in the treatment of female journalists, and that journalists are also assigned difficult tasks to do in the newsroom. I mean, once one is mentored and guided to handle a political story, there should be no problems or challenges. It's just a matter of simply assigning one and helping them get through the steps and helping them write the story, not to write for them per se, but just making sure that they have that opportunity to prove themselves, that they can tackle a difficult topic. Then they can be a powerful journalist to be reckoned with. What journalists in Zimbabwe are clamoring for at the moment is proper accreditation, registration of bona fide journalists. At the current moment, there are a lot of strangers that we do not know who seem to work in the journalism profession. And I'm not referring to the Fifth Estate or the citizen journalists, no, I'm referring to people who masquerade as journalists, people who come from the security sector pretending to be journalists who are double accredited. Either they're accredited as police officers or as members of the military, but then you find them also becoming journalists, and that is not what we want. We want proper bona fide accreditation of journalists who produce the real news, who are credible, who are accountable to the audiences, and that is what we want. This is what can take our journalism forward.
That was Brenda Harris, a Zimbabwean journalist, speaking to us about the difficulties of being a journalist, not just in South Africa. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we speak to Zoe Mafoko. We have hit the final segment of the show. Welcome back to it. So tonight we are speaking the protection of female journalists, and we're now about to speak to Zoe Mafoko, who is herself a journalism student at Rhodes University. We head over to the city of Makhanda to hear what she has to say.
Tell us what you study and how you found the course up until now.
Okay, so I am studying my third year of Bachelor of Journalism, and I am majoring in International Studies and Political Sciences, as well as Radio Journalism and Media Studies. I found my courses to be quite rigorous. I've enjoyed every minute of them throughout the course of this year. In terms of journalism, we've been through media law, to media representations and how people represent themselves in the media, to power politics in media. And then in my radio, or rather in my politics and international studies courses, we've gone from African politics to gender and sexuality, to international studies and the study of international organizations.
How prepared do you feel to become a female journalist?
I think that's quite a tough question. I think my school of journalism is fantastic. They're really, really good at, giving us on-the-job training in terms of ensuring that we go out and get real-life experience, in terms of preparing us theoretically. But I think where they do fail to prepare us is to actually discuss being a female in journalistic spaces in South Africa. I know during the death of Winene this year, we were asked to cover, the memorial and everything that was happening here on campus, and everyone just blatantly refused. And I think, sometimes in things like that, my department does tend to act without thinking, without realizing the kinds of impact that something like that would have on us personally, and without taking into account that we might have our own experiences. A lot of the time we just kind of get thrown into the deep end, and there's no conversation about being a female, or just being a journalist in general, when you're actively on the field. There's always funny anecdotes from our lecturers about their time going out into the field and things like that, but there's no actual we don't really get to see the bad side, I guess we could call it, of journalism. So yeah.
Okay. What do you think schools can do to prepare female journalists and journalists in general to better prepare students for the more personal and emotional side to journalism?
I think there needs to actually be a conversation, first of all. There needs to be a conversation that, look, you are a female going into a journalistic space. I know one of the best experiences that we actually got was covering the president when he came here for Freedom Day to address South Africa while he was here. And, those kinds of experiences are invaluable, and that's amazing. But I think without actually sitting to discuss the different intersectionalities of our identities while we're in those kinds of spaces. I think a lot of the time that fails to prepare us. So that's definitely one of the things. I think we could get more experience on the field. A lot of the time we're kind of, I don't want to say restricted, but kind of limited to working on stories that are on campus. And even though they say yes, go outside of campus, there is no real opportunity for that unless you create it for yourself. So I think would be really important to get more hands-on experience, to have these kinds of discussions and recognize that we are different individuals with different intersectioning identities and things like that, and that is going to matter when we do go out into the field. So yeah.
Okay, thank you.
That was Zoe Mafoko giving us some insight into the academic realm of journalism. So we have hit the final part of the show. We are going to get into our community notice board right about now. Let's see what this week's community notice board looks like. And that was our community notice board for this evening. So thank you for choosing me to free your minds with here on Free Media, Free Minds this evening on Cape Town TV. Thanks to my guests, Crystal Alderson, Brenda Harris, and Zoe Mafoko for joining us in this conversation. If you'd like to join or if you'd like to continue the conversation, you can join us at freemedia.freeminds on Instagram or Free Media Free Minds on Facebook. So from me, Chelsea Noah Ogilvie, good night, keep it real, and if it's unreal, keep it anyway.